Okay. Welcome, everyone. We'll give a little bit of time for people to join us. Right. So welcome to Preservation North Carolina's Shelter Series. I'm Julianne Patterson, and I'm Preservation North Carolina's Outreach Manager. Our Shelter Series is virtual programming that allows us to connect with preservationists across the state on a variety of topics. Several of our programs this year have focused on stories or themes that relate to a traveling exhibit we debuted earlier this year called We Built This, that profiles Black architects and builders in North Carolina. The exhibit is currently in two places right now, the Bellamy Mansion Museum in Wilmington and the Pack Library in Asheville. You can find more information about the exhibit and future events on our website, preservationnorthcarolina.org. And I also wanted to tell you about our next Shelter Series, which will be a little different. It's going to be more of an interactive book club, which we're going to try out for the first time. But we'll be joined by North Carolina author Kiana Alexander to talk about the untold story of Josephine Leary through her new book, Carolina Built. For those that don't know, Josephine Leary was enslaved before emancipation and then became a real estate developer. She was way ahead of her time, and one of the buildings that she developed still stands in downtown Edenton along Broad Street. Alexander's book is a fictional narrative, but it's based in factual accounts and research from Leary's own personal papers that are at the Duke Archives. So the book includes stories of real figures in history, including the Badham family of builders. So I hope you'll read the book, which is available for purchase at a discount on our website, and bring your questions for a fun conversation next month on September 6th. The Shelter Series has always been free of charge, and we plan to keep it that way, but I wanted to extend a huge thank you to anyone who added a donation to your registration today. It's greatly appreciated, and it helps us keep these programs going. Because this is a webinar, we can't see or hear you, but we still know you're there and we want to answer your questions. So please ask questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I'll moderate all questions at the end of the presentation. If you're joining us live on Facebook, you can ask a question in the comments, and if you have technical issues, please let me know in the chat box and I'll do my best to help. Now on today's presentation. I'm joined by Dr. Tara White, who's an assistant professor at UNC-Wilmington. Dr. White specializes in public history, as well as African American, civil rights, and women's history. She's going to take us back to the end of the 19th century to highlight the advocacy and community efforts of African American women at the beginning of the national preservation movement. Dr. White's presentation will explore the contributions and lasting impact Black women's organizations had on pioneering historic preservation in the 20th century, a story I knew nothing about as someone who works in the field of historic preservation. Dr. White is finalizing a publication on this topic to share it more broadly, but today she is sharing it with us. So with that, I just want to say thank you again to everyone who's joining us, and I will hand things over to Dr. White. So go ahead, Dr. White.
Thank you. And it's great to be here, and really good to be here talking about the ladies that I spent a lot of time with. And so what I want to do is I want to, just kind of talk about these African American women and their activities, kind of what they did and why they did what they did. And so this particular work, A Shrine of Liberty for the Unborn Generations, African American Clubwomen and the Preservation of African American Historic Sites, seeks to contest the history of historic preservation. And what I want to do is I want to basically place African American women into the history of historic preservation, just so that we know that they were preservationists, that they were actively preserving historic places across the South and across the nation, but also that this movement was parallel to the movements by white women to preserve historic sites that began in the 1850s, and what had not happened before was that, well, there wasn't a parallel. There was a parallel. There wasn't some crossover that we expected. So, anyways, but I also want you to know that this is just one little piece of a larger body of work that has been done and that is currently being done on African American women, particularly ones who've worked in women's clubs and in other African American organizations. And then finally, this is, more for us to understand how historic memory, right? Our ideas about how we remember the past as as communities, and as larger cities, states, and regions. This is a part of that conversation that we have had and continue to have about how we remember the past. So I want to start with this quote by Mary McLeod Bethune. And Mary McLeod Bethune, most of us are familiar with her work as a college president, that she is the founder of Bethune-Cookman College, which is now Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona Beach, Florida. Or we're familiar with her work as the founder and founding president of the National Council of Negro Women. Some of us are familiar with her as the subject of a statue that was actually just placed in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital. But most people do not know that she started her advocacy work as a member of the National Association of Colored Women, and ascended to the presidency in the 1920s. And she was a big advocate of the Douglass home, which we'll talk more about in a little bit. But she talked about the Douglass home as a huge accomplishment, because for the National Association this was. But it was also in her mind not just about maintaining this house, but it was also about the spirit of Douglass, right? And actually memorializing him and his reverence for liberty and freedom. Most of us know Frederick Douglass as the person who basically emancipated himself, left Maryland, ended up in Rochester, New York, and was an advocate for African Americans to several presidents, Lincoln first, and then many others after that. But Douglass also was one of the most recognizable people in the 19th century, and very well known, very articulate, spoke multiple languages and wrote in multiple languages and whatever. But Douglass was an advocate, a fierce advocate for freedom, and that was one of the things that she pointed out. And it was important for her to point this out during the time she was doing it, because the 1920s were a very interesting time for our country. And so she says that this home is a monument for martyrdom for freedom, to martyrdom for freedom, as well as our reverence for the spirit of Douglass. The home must be preserved, and she uses this term as a shrine of liberty for the unborn generation of Negroes. And Bethune saw this, not only the Douglass home, but the preservation of it as an important thing to do for unborn generations. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what are we talking about when we speak of these women? And what I want to do is I want to place this whole conversation in context. One of the things we see here, and I'm going to go back, is that at the beginning of at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, what you see, end of the 19th century, post Reconstruction, is that as Reconstruction, actually as Reconstruction is happening, and towards into the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Gilded Age, you see people start to actually talk about what the war meant, what the Civil War meant. And we're talking the Civil War, one of the most devastating events to happen on American soil. More than 600,000 people killed in that war. The South pretty much lost a generation of young men in this war, right? And it visited untold devastation on the South. And so Reconstruction was about rebuilding the nation, rebuilding the South, but also it was about revisiting some of the ideas that we had as a country before the war about liberty, about citizenship, ideas about who belonged to the nation and who did not, right? And this was something that we see not only Southern white and black men talk about, but we also see Southern white and black women take up these same conversations and talk about these same things. And so the meaning of the war gets to be interpreted, or starts to be interpreted, during the war and during Reconstruction and immediately after. And what you see is that has an impact on what is preserved later on. Okay. Now, historic preservation efforts, and when we think about the history of historic preservation, it usually starts about in the 1850s with the shrines to founding fathers, people like George Washington, people like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and those guys, those great white men who were engaged in founding this country, right? And there are women who are involved in the efforts to preserve these sites, to make sure that these sites and these shrines to these great white men are preserved. And so we usually start the story in the 1850s with people like the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and Pamela Cunningham, and we look at how and why they're preserving this, this wonderful historic place, and for people like Cunningham, who is preserving Mount Vernon, this is a really interesting step, because Cunningham, everybody is really at, during the time that the Mount Vernon is being preserved, people are really clear that there will be a civil war. So that's something something to really keep in mind. But the other thing that's important about Mount Vernon is that in addition to being on the precipice of just right on the verge of civil war, the ideas again that people are going back to, both folks for the United States and the Confederacy, are these ideas that come from the founding, right? This ragtag nation of young upstarts that are committed to a particular ideal that they're willing to fight and go to battle for, right? And we see, although the nation is and not even 100 years old, right? But going to battle for a particular set of ideas, right? you see on the other side, on the Confederate side, the same thing. And in fact, what is really interesting as the Confederacy chooses its iconography and its official seal is in that official seal for the Confederacy. You have a man, young man on a horse, right, who is indicative of the Confederacy. What we know is that that young man on the horse is actually George Washington, right? And so you have this founding father who is considered a founding father, right, to both nations. Washington as a young Southerner and as a young Southern slaveholder, right? So as Cunningham and those ladies are working to preserve the history and the memory of this founding father and of his work, this is also in play. And so keep in mind that has a huge part, the preservation of these memories, but also the preservation of the memory of the South in a particular way. Okay, and so for white women of the South in the post-Civil War era, unfortunately, like I said, there was a generation of young men lost, and so these women are preserving basically memorializing dead, and not that women in the United States or in the Union effort aren't doing the same thing, because you do have those memorials, but since the majority of this war is fought in the South, right, and you have just widespread destruction of property and life in the South. This is a great opportunity to preserve, to not only memorialize the dead, but to talk about why. Now, of course, this is a war that the South lost, or I would say the Confederacy, because not all Southern states were members of the Confederate effort. But this is a war that the Confederacy lost, and lost resoundingly, right? And so there is a real effort to justify this grand loss of life and grand loss of property, and to justify this war effort. And so this notion of justification for the war effort that we now call the lost cause, right, starts to happen during the war. We see people start to talk about superior numbers and resources, and so forth and so on, as justifications for why the South loses this war. And we also see ways of justifying taking this stand. People were going to war to defend their homes and their honor, and so forth and so on, right? And so we see this play out during the rest of the war, and then the latter part of the Reconstruction period, talking about why they went to war. But also at the same time as we see the memorialization continue and then come to a certain point, we also see a shift in the conversation about why this war happens, and a shift in the conversation that actually is not as much about the war itself and the loss of life, but it's more about the Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction period. The Reconstruction period, where you have freed people who had been property of people in the South for so many years, now actually not only becoming freed by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, but also becoming citizens, birthright citizens, due to the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And then finally, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, guaranteeing the right to vote for African American men, right? And so this conversation starts to shift, and it's like, okay, it's not just about why the war happened and looking backwards, but it's also looking at the current situation and the what the topsy turvy state of social relationships and political relationships in the South. And so you have people who had been property who are now sharing in the governing of the South for the first time. And you have a lot of resentment, resentment based on the idea that these people are not actually qualified, to be voters. They're not qualified to actually understand and appreciate citizenship, and that they're not qualified and should not be should not have a place in the and a say in what happens in the South. And so there's an effort, real pushback in the early days of Reconstruction. And then towards the latter half of Reconstruction, you see a real effort to undo the work of Reconstruction, to undo these Republican black and tan coalitions that pop up around the South. And there's a movement to actually enshrine what we now know as white supremacy, and actually not as what we now know, but what they call a white supremacy movement that starts towards the end of Reconstruction, really, and just kind of escalates as we get towards the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And you see this white supremacy movement, this idea that that African Americans are not capable and not fit to lead, and need to be actually led by whites. That whites are the only people fit to lead the South. You see this movement start to play out around the South in most of the former states of the Confederacy. And so this movement that starts, actually as a memorialization for the Confederate dead, and gets into kind of justifying the war effort for white women, take a considerable turn, and actually kind of latches on and contributes to the whole white supremacy movement that you see in the late 19th and early 20th century in the South. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But for black women, black men and black women in the South, as they see the tide changing, because what starts to happen is they start to the rights that they actually got during Reconstruction start to erode, and you start to see the rolling back of these rights as you get out of Reconstruction and into towards the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. And what they're really working on is trying to maintain their rights of citizenship, trying to hold the line on the racial violence that they started experiencing during Reconstruction and continue to experience. And then also these men and women are starting to put down their own stories, their own ideas about what the war was about, but their own ideas about how they contributed to the war effort, right? And as citizens and patriots and whatever, and also African American women are particularly influential in really trying to show Black humanity, racial progress, and justifying their right to vote and equal citizenship, which they'll have to do in order to regain that right. And so across the South, I spoke about several women's organizations that, of course, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association was created in 1858, and it's about the preservation of the legacy of George Washington, right, as a founding father. But you also start to see other organizations, right? You have other organizations that want to preserve the history, or that whose goals it is to preserve the history of the South. And so you have organizations like the Ladies Hermitage Association that is preserving the history of the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home there in Tennessee, and right outside of Nashville. And we'll go back to Nashville a little bit. You have the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, formed to preserve the legacies of early Virginia and those early presidents who are there in Virginia, and those that founding generation. You have the Colonial Dames of America and the National Society of Colonial Dames, and these are mostly hereditary organizations for folks who can trace their lineages back to the colonial period, but also very influential in creating that memory and that historical landscape that we see, to show what life was like in a particular period, in a particular time. And the colonial dames, they are still very active in doing this work of preserving historic houses and historic places around the South and around the country. But one other organization you have, and that we talked about, the Ladies Memorial Associations putting out memorials for the Confederate dead. Well, what starts to happen is a coalescing of these notions that not only are they preserving the history of, or they're memorializing the dead, but they're also preserving the history of the Confederacy. And so you have in Nashville a meeting of these ladies' memorial associations from around the South, and they create the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1894, with the express aim of preserving the history of the Confederate war effort and memorializing the Confederate war dead. But they also have another aim that develops later, and it's women who are very, very influential in that third goal, and that is to defend the South, and actually to make sure that the Southern version of history, the Southern version of what happened during the war, what eventually becomes the lost cause version, right, of Southern history that justifies the war, that actually makes sure that people understand that the South was outnumbered, that they had to go to war, that this was not about slavery at all. African Americans were very happy during slavery. This was not about that. This was about states' rights, right? And so some of the tenets of the lost cause you see actually being developed and developing during this time and by the ladies of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And one particular person who is really instrumental in that spreading of the doctrine is a person by the name of Mildred Lewis Rutherford. And it is Mildred Lewis Rutherford, as Grand Historian of the UDC, who is most influential in making sure that the lost cause version of the the Civil War and Reconstruction, the lost cause version of why the South went to war, of why Reconstruction was a failure, of why these women were important, or their version of history was important and needed to be in all schools. Mildred was very influential in making sure that happened. Mildred was also very influential in making sure that that version was the version that was present in most schools. You'll see Mildred appealing to school boards and state boards of education to make sure that that version is the version that played out. You also see this, and it's not just in the South. You saw this in all over the country, right? Where there was history instruction, that the UDC was very influential in making sure that the Southern version of the history of Civil War and Reconstruction was the version that got out. She was also influential, and she and the ladies of the UDC made sure that there were monuments everywhere. There were monuments and memorials to the UDC as far west as Washington State and Oregon, right? Had nothing to do with the Civil War, but there were memorials as far west as that, right? And in many northern states. And so you had a really kind of Rutherford and the UDC ladies, kind of blanketing the South and in many cases the nation with this version of history that sought to relegate African Americans to the past and to second class status in American society. And you had other women who were determined that that would not be so. And so the National Association of Colored Women was created in 1896. They were actually created from a merger of a variety of women's organizations. The DC Colored Women's League, which actually had a bunch of women there, and then the National Federation of Afro-American Women. They also had a large number of women. And so you have these two groups come together in 1896, couple of years, only a year after Frederick Douglass's death, and decide that they had to come together to uplift their country, their race, but also this was an opportunity for these women to make change in their communities and to stand together as one united voice. While they were coming together, the case that had just been heard or was being heard in the Supreme Court was the case of Homer Plessy versus the versus Ferguson, right, out of New Orleans. And what was the result, or the result was, unfortunately, the decision we now know as the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, which established the foundation for separate, what we now know as separate but equal, or legalized segregation. And so these women are actually coming together, meeting and deciding to not only do programming and work to uplift their local communities, but to stand together as a united voice against this push to actually put them back into, or place them into second class status as American citizens. And so you see, amongst these women, the vanguard of Black women leaders in the United States, people like Mary Church Terrell, people like Margaret Murray Washington, the wife of Booker T. Washington. Harriet Tubman actually was there at the founding meeting. People like Ida B. Wells, the suffragette, but also anti-lynching crusader. And then, of course, people like Mary Talbert. Mary Talbert, another clubwoman from Buffalo, who later goes on to the presidency. So these women are amongst the founders. Also, and I want to, I'm making this point because it's important to understand the context. Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, and Mary Talbert are also among the women who are founders of the National Association of Color, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, when it was founded in 1909. So that is another perspective, if you want some context of these women and the things that they're trying to accomplish in society. So these are amongst the women who are founders of this organization. And a part of that, a part of their purpose, they list in their documents, is to furnish evidence of the moral, mental, and material progress made by the people of color through the efforts of their women. And they want to make sure that people know that, you know, at these African Americans, these freed men and freed women who are by this point at least, you know, 30 years out, because slavery ends in 1865. So 30 years out of slavery, that these people are actually making progress, that they're creating institutions, that they're creating communities, that they're getting better and doing better and doing a lot with their citizenship, right? And so this is one big piece of what they do, and we'll talk some about how they do that. And so what they want to do as club women, in addition to, and when we think about club women, we think about the social, we think about tea parties and social events and whatever. And I'm not saying that these women did not do some of those things, but their primary goal was really about showing Black progress. They believed that by showing Black progress, right, they were actually proving, this was evidence, that they were worthy of citizenship, and they were worthy of the franchise. They were worthy to be included in the decision-making process of, and in the political life of America, right? And this was also an opportunity, in addition to showing evidence of African American progress, this was also an opportunity for them to speak directly to African Americans and to instill race pride in a time where being black was very negative, right? And we did not or have not talked about progressive era ideas about people, but this is the time. This is during the time when social Darwinism and the notion of this hierarchy of races, right? And fitness and racial fitness is at its height, right? And African Americans are not one of the fittest races. In fact, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are the people who are considered the fittest race. And you have this social science that relegates African Americans to the very bottom of the racial hierarchy, right? And so these ideas are ideas that these women are fighting in the work that they do in communities. And so every community institution that they found, all of the churches, the banks, the hospitals, the colleges, the schools that they create and they found is more and more evidence, right? And more and more evidence against the lie of black inferiority, which is what these theories basically said. And so, and it was also an opportunity to show people that given the opportunity that African Americans could be good citizens and do good in their communities and their local and state and regions. So anyways, and so you have this notion of these women and them wanting to show, right? Show evidence and to show how things are working out. And so they use history. They actually take history and use it and apply it to show that they are making good and that they're doing better and that they're accomplishing and creating and developing. And so these women are influenced by historians of the time. At the time, you have people like W.E.B. Du Bois, first PhD out of in history out of Harvard University, and Carter Woodson, who is the second PhD out of Harvard in history out of Harvard, but Woodson, who also creates an association, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915, and then the Journal of Negro History in 1916. And both of these, the organization and the journal, the whole purpose was really about showing that their African Americans have a history, that the Negroes have a history, and to show how Negroes have contributed to American history. And so these women, Woodson creates this association and becomes, really engaged in growing the association with branches around the country. He creates the journal and pulls in scholars, as people go, to specialize in very different things, pulling in scholars from a lot of different places to show the facts of Negro history. And again, part of this is about countering those ideas of black inferiority, of African Americans as the bottom of the social Darwinistic pyramid, so to speak. And so these women join with him. He's actually creating materials by this point, not only for just regular ordinary black people, but also for schools, because he's been trained not only as a teacher. He teaches in high schools for a long time, then goes on to teach on the college level and the graduate level. And so he has experience developing materials for what we now know as K-12, and he uses that experience to create to write a couple of textbooks specifically geared towards K-12 teachers, to make sure that they supplement these textbooks that have been influenced by people like Mildred, right? And in Negro schools across the country. And so you have people like him who's talking to these teachers. The majority of the teaching force then, just like now, is predominantly female, predominantly women. So he's talking to and dealing with a lot of women. And it just so happened that the majority of these club women are educated women, and as educated women, the majority of them are school teachers. And so they're working and working together for the same purpose. So you have these school teachers working with the association and Woodson to promote not only African American history, but also to help teach it in the schools. By the time Mary McLeod Bethune becomes engaged with the association, she has already not only been past president of the NACW, but she had also created the National Council of Negro Women, and which is an association of Black women's organizations. So it's an association of associations. But Bethune was chosen and elected the board president for the association, and as an educator herself, created what was called the Negro History Bulletin. This was another journal created specifically for K-12 educators to help them teach African American history in elementary and high schools. So a supplementary textbook and supplementary teaching materials. But you have these members, these NACW women, who are working with Woodson and who are kind of outspreading the gospel of Black history across elementary and high schools around the country, Black elementary and Black high schools around the country, because we do have segregated schools. And just know that these women were ardent supporters of the association. So you have this, hand in glove kind of work over the life of the association with these club women. And some of these women who go on to create or who are very much engaged in preserving African American history include women like Mary Talbert, women like Nanny Helen Burroughs, who's involved with the Women's Auxiliary of the National Baptist Convention, which is one of the largest Black organizations in the country. You also have women like Mary Church Terrell here, who is very local. She's a teacher in DC, club leader in DC, and of course, the very first president of the NACW. You have Margaret Murray Washington here, the third wife of Booker T. Washington, who is, pretty much the anointed leader of African Americans after Frederick Douglass dies. And then last but not least, you have people like who are supporting the cause, people like Madam C.J. Walker here. Madam C.J. Walker, who is a self-made millionaire, and I think actually, yes. But anyways, Madam Walker is going to be important to the Douglass story, and so as they decide to get engaged, after they create the organization, that June of 1896, one of the things they do, and this is immediately as the folks are leaving, is they leave the meeting and they go by the home of Frederick Douglass. Remember, 1895, Douglass dies of a massive heart attack. So his wife, his second wife, Helen, is there at the meeting. She invites people to come by the home and to visit with her and whatever. And keep in mind that Helen Pitts Douglass, the second wife of Frederick Douglass, is a white woman. So that is very interesting during that time. But the other thing that's important about Helen Pitts Douglass is that she's a suffragette, and of course, the suffrage movement is in full swing at this point. And then finally, Helen Pitts Douglass is really mindful of who her husband is, that he is one of the most, or was one of the most influential people, black or white, in America at the time of his death, right? One of the most well recognized folks, one of the most photographed persons in America during that time, right? She's very clear about who her husband is and about his influence, and she's very clear about what he means to American history. So she is determined that her husband would be honored in some way after his death. Now, the home that they live in is in a place called Anacostia, little community in Washington D.C., and the home is called Cedar Hill. They bought He bought the home actually in 1877, where he lived with his first wife, Anna Murray Douglass, and his children. Anna Murray died, and so in 1882, and so when he married his second wife, Helen, he is there in D.C. with Helen. Okay, at the in Cedar Hill, living with Helen, and they lived there. They added some things to it, and that was their home when he actually dropped dead at his home in 1895 of a massive heart attack. Douglass, Pitts Douglass, his widow, after his death, decided that she needed to make sure that Douglass's memory was intact. But before that, she had the business of taking care of his estate. And what is unfortunate is that Douglass's children did not see the things the same way. So they wanted their inheritance out of the house. She mortgaged the home to actually pay the heirs out, and she had to pay off this mortgage. And so initially she starts speaking, and inviting people over and to tour the house. People would give her donations towards the mortgage and whatever. She eventually goes on to charter the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association with Congress in 1900, because again, she's very much aware of how historically significant her husband is, and want to make sure that his memory is preserved. And so she continues to operate the house. She goes on speaking tours and all kinds of other things while she's yet alive, so that she could maintain Douglass's maintain this home and keep people engaged in his memory, and keep his memory alive. When she dies in 1913, you had a group of folks who had been working with her since the early part, so since 1903, working with her to actually pay off this mortgage, right? And so this Memorial and Historical Association board is working with her to do that, right? And as far as they go along, they're not really able, and these are the leading black men in the country, like Booker T. Washington and others, not really able to pay this mortgage off. And so you have Pitts Douglas, who has left this home in the care of the Memorial Association. And they, really are having a hard time paying off the mortgage. And so the women of the National Association of Colored Women are approached about helping these men pay this mortgage off. And so what the women do is they start to raise the money, and in fact, they raise the money. So by their 1916 biennial meeting, these women had raised all of the money to actually pay off the mortgage for the Frederick Douglass home. They assumed all of the seats on the Historical and Memorial Association board, and for the next 50 some years, it was the NACW working with the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association to maintain the Frederick Douglass home as a historic site until 1962, when it became a unit of the Park Service. So you have 50 years of this organization now, and now the NACW is not a preservation organization like the other organizations. They are, as I said, looking to furnish evidence of African American progress in a lot of areas. And so their agenda is really, really full, as they are also trying to balance preserving Douglass's home and also Douglass's memory in this house. So, but they managed to do it, and they managed to keep the home intact and also to preserve it until the Park Service assumed ownership of it in 1962. But these women are not just preserving Douglass's home and supporting that project. They're supporting other preservation projects around the country, and that's the other thing that's important about this. You see them create exhibits for the initially for the Atlanta Cotton States exhibition in 1895 in Atlanta, but every other exhibition after that. They are there in 1896 in Tennessee, the Tennessee Centennial Exhibition. The Centennial Exhibition, they're there. They have a building at the 1901 Pan American Exhibition, the 1904 exhibition I think it's in New Orleans. They have a building there. And so they are engaged in creating and making sure that people see African American progress in all of these places, right, where you have a national presence. You also see these women involved in other or supporting other historic preservation projects. The Paul Laurence Dunbar home in Dayton, Ohio, they are supporters of the home, and they send donations there. They also send donations to the John Brown farm. They see John Brown as a martyr and think that he is an important person to the history, not just of the nation in the Civil War, but also African Americans. They support his home project, his home being preserved as well, early preservation efforts there. And finally, the Harriet Tubman home, because of course I mentioned Tubman as one of the folks who attended that first, that organized a meeting of the NACW in 1896, and the Empire State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, which was the New York State Federation, led by Mary Talbert, who I mentioned earlier. They also assumed some of the responsibility of helping to preserve the Harriet Tubman home. The Tubman home is now a Park Service site in upstate New York. And so they have this legacy. By the time the Bethune goes off and founds the Council House and creates the Council House, creates the National Association of Colored Women. My apologies. In 1935, they have a track record. They've been preserving a historic house for a while, and so when their site, she actually creates another organization. She purchases this house in also in Washington D.C. In 1940s to serve as a headquarters for the UNC-W, but also to serve as her Washington residence while she's in D.C. Taking care of business. And so she already has, like I said, experience preserving a historic site. She already has experience promoting African American history, because by this point she's already the president of the association's board. And so this site then becomes another place where she can preserve and promote African American history, but specifically Black women's history, because she is the head of this organization of Black women. So you have the creation of the National Archives of Black women's history here in the 1930s and 40s, right? And Bethune pulling in people like Dorothy Porter Wesley, who was the person over the Moreland collection at Howard University in Washington. The Moreland collection that became the Moreland Spingarn collection, one of the world's largest collections of African American history and historic stuffs in the world, right? Dorothy Wesley came in and helped to organize that, and then she called in Sue Bailey Thurman, the wife of theologian Howard Thurman, to actually help her organize this archive, which continued which remained in the building. In 1966, they had a fire. It forced them to move the site, and Dorothy Height, who's now who's the president of the council in 1966. Dorothy Height does not want to abandon this building that these women had worked so hard to purchase, but also that housed this great archive. And so what she does is she decides she raises some money and pulls in a scholar, an African American woman historian by the name of Betty Collier Thomas, to help her organize and open this as a museum. And so they organize this house, they renovate it, and organize and opens this house up in 1979 as the Bethune Museum and Archives in Washington D.C. and reintroduces the National Archives of Black Women's History there. It is also during the same time that Collier Thomas pulls in a variety of African American women historians, and they through a series of meetings create what is now known as the Association of Black Women's Historians, and Collier Thomas is in that inaugural group of Black women who are PhD trained historians. And so they preserved the house, opened the house as a museum in 79, and from 79 until the 1990s, the NACW is then doing the same work. NCNW is doing the same work as the NACW and preserving this house until it also becomes a National Park Service site in 1994. And both of these sites, and I want to want to close with this. Both of these sites are basically of 100 years. Just these two sites, and keep in mind there are lots and lots of other activities and things that people do, but these two sites by themselves represent about 100 years worth of Black women working to through their organizations to preserve African American history, right? And to actually place on the landscape historic sites that speak to, the progress of African Americans, historic sites that actually show the trajectory of African American history, and also historic sites that really push back against these ideas, the lost cause ideas about African American inferiority, and also the ideas that support disfranchisement and the racial violence that we see in the early 20th century. And so these sites are important. They're important markers, two important markers for the work that club women did during the late 19th and early 20th century, but they're also important markers for the ongoing trajectory of African American history, African American women's history, of course, and preservation history, the history of historic preservation. So I'm going to wrap it up because I've been talking a long time. So I'm going to wrap it up there and take questions. And I am looking forward to hearing from you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And so just a reminder to everybody, if you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, I will moderate them. And I have a question of my own. First, to start out, in those two sites, so the Frederick Douglass House, and then is it the
Bethune
Council
Council
House?
House.
Do you know, it's been so long since I've been to the Douglass site, but do they incorporate the role, like the history of both of those sites in the history of historic preservation as a movement in their interpretation? Or is that kind of an afterthought and it's more a focus on the history of the individuals?
They really talk mostly about the history of those individuals. That was um, the history of them in the history of historic preservation, something that they realized later, of course, after I started talking about that. But yeah, yes, no, that was an afterthought. They
Okay.
really didn't get that. Wow. So this site really, in addition to preserving the memory of Douglass and Douglass's ideals, it really does represent it's an important site in the history of historic preservation. They didn't get that until later.
Which, I mean, that's not even a huge aspect or component of Mount Vernon's interpretation either. So I was just curious to know. But then we have a question from Myra Coward, who's the president of Preservation North Carolina, and he wants to know: do you know of any like specific to North Carolina examples?
Well, specific to North Carolina examples off the top of my head, I think about the preservation of the home of people like Charlotte Hawkins Brown uh, in the Palmer Memorial Institute, right? Charlotte Hawkins Brown was not only an educator and a club woman here in North Carolina, but she was also a past president of the National Association and also active in the preservation of the Douglass home. And so it's these, she is another person who is, she's worked with the Douglass Home Committee with people like Nanny Helen Burroughs to help preserve this home. And so it's people like her who, actually helped to do this work. But then later on, realized, there were folks who realized the importance of her story and her work. And so you see this ongoing struggle to preserve the Palmer Memorial Institute and that work that Charlotte Hawkins Brown did in Sedalia as well. So, yeah. So that's one off the top of my head.
Great. We have a question from Barry, who asks, how has historic preservation changed since the start of the civil rights movement?
So since the start of the historic, the civil rights movement, the change has been the ideas. Well, okay, so you have a couple of there were a couple things happening after the civil rights movement. One was the idea that there weren't enough African American historic sites. So you start to see people push to have more black sites included. And some of that, you had two things happen. Of course, immediately after the 65 Voting Rights Act, you have the Historic Preservation Act, right? National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which actually establishes a national preservation, national preservation law and all of the law that goes around it, the Section 106, all of that stuff, right? And sets up these preservation agencies in states around the country. So, most of our state SHPOs, as we call them, state historic preservation offices, date back to the Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And so as these sites are, and the notion of the National Register, right, are coming on, that's 66. A decade later, we have what? The bicentennial, right? And so the bicentennial actually fuels this notion of preserving sites, right? And getting things on the register and things that are representative of American history on the register. And you have, it's just at the same time that this is happening, you also have a movement in cities to actually clean up slums, right? So slum clearance, urban renewal, all of these things converge to create a movement for preserving African American history as well, right? And so as people are preparing for the bicentennial, they're putting more stuff into the hopper to be preserved as national sites. You also have a movement of African Americans who are determined that there are certain sites that need to go into the National Register. In fact, in the 1970s, the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation, this is the name of the group, acts as an advisory to the bicentennial group, right? And they are recommending to the Bicentennial Commission lists and lists of African American sites all over the country, right, that should be added to the National Register. So you have sites like the King Memorial, well, not King Memorial because King Center doesn't exist then. You have Dexter Avenue in Montgomery, my hometown. I'm from Montgomery, Alabama. Dexter Avenue, where King had served as pastor and his only pastorate, that was recommended for the National Register. You have the home of course, Frederick Douglass's home, because although it went on, it became a National Park Service site in '62, right? it didn't become a national register site until later, if that makes sense, right? Because
Yeah.
those are two different processes. So you have a list of homes of very prominent, Tuskegee Institute, the George Washington Carver Museum, a lot of other places are actually recommended for placement on the National Register as a result of the Civil Rights Movement and this focus on African American history and African American culture that comes out of that movement.
Well, it also makes me think what you said about kind of the impetus for the movement for both white women and Black women as interpreting kind of the Civil War and Reconstruction and how what they were seeking to achieve was kind of in response to that interpretation process and how many times we've probably gone through that through our history, especially after the civil rights movement, but even just in the last 3 or 4 years, looking at current events and how that's changed kind of motivations for what we want to preserve, even in the distant past, just a new perspective of looking at things. So it's interesting to think about that going forward. We have another question from, well, not another question from this person, but we do have a question. This will probably be the final question from Carl Nold, who asks, we have a number of great preservation projects underway in North Carolina for Nina Simone, Thomas Day, Pauli Murray. Are African American women's groups involved in similar projects today around the country?
Actually, they are, and hello, Carl Knoll. And I remember Carl Knoll from Spania and um, from Michigan and from Cooperstown.
Cool. Okay.
But yes, so African American women still are in the vanguard of preservation and preservationists. Now, he mentioned the Pauli Murray home and the Nina Simone home, which are both being preserved by Nina Simone's home. I think more the artistic
Mm-hmm.
community of musicians and artists, and Pauli Murray home, more the LGBTQ community has risen up to preserve that structure. But African American women have been engaged in both of those projects. Pauli Murray, I know there were a couple of women's groups engaged in that project, partly because Pauli Murray was a member of a whole lot of stuff. One of which was the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and they had been engaged in um, um, pres- working towards that project. But also the women of if I'm not mistaken, the National Council of Negro Women, and I'll go back and check that. But there are other projects. The Harriet Tubman home in upstate New York, still that's still being still a project of the Empire State Federation, and they're still engaged with it. And there are many other projects around the country. I could not put all of these projects in this dissertation, but there was the Lucy Craft Laney Museum in Augusta, Georgia, that I wanted to include in the dissertation. That's being preserved by the Delta Sigma Theta sorority there in Augusta, Georgia. Then there's a Pleasant Ore House there. The women of Alpha Kappa Alpha were instrumental in helping to preserve the King home and the King birthplace, and getting that into the system of the King Center, and then helping to get that into the park system. So there still are lots of groups, from the club women to the sororities, that are engaged in these local communities. And like I said, I was trying to actually graduate uh, and get out of graduate school before the end of the 21st century. So I couldn't include them all, but yes, there are still lots of women and lots of Black women's groups engaged in preservation.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending. And this has been recorded and will be live on our website later this week for anyone who wants to share it. And then I just have two comments that I want to read out so that you definitely see them, Dr. White. But we have a comment from saying the presentation was magnificent from Dr. Wilma Peebles Wilkins, who's a former resident of historic Oberlin Village in Raleigh, as well as from Angela Henry saying, I'd like to extend my appreciation of your time, Dr. White, for this informative presentation. So thank you so much. And thank you again. I look forward to reading the publication once it's available. Good luck with that.
I'm working on it. I'm working day and night. Thank you for having
Take care.
me.
Thank
Take care.
you. Bye.